Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be the second half of part one, and we're about to get into a little bit of the healthcare system in the United States and how that, reacted to the coronavirus when it really peaked in March, April 2020. So let's begin. U.S. health system colludes with pandemic. Let me begin by indicating what some of the problems are that a capitalist medical system of the sort that we have in the United States presents when dealing with something as big as the coronavirus pandemic. On one hand, 30 million Americans have no medical insurance. This means that they don't go to the doctor when they have something they think is a passing flu, viral, bacterial, because they can't afford to pay the astronomical cost that confronts someone without insurance. Likewise, for such a person to go to the emergency room, which would be an option under other circumstances, becomes something you don't want to do in the face of a crisis. This is especially true because if there are likely to be people infected by this virus, you're going to find them in an emergency room. On the other hand, 100 million Americans have insurance, but with such high deductibles and/or sizable copays that they don't have the money to cover them. They will hesitate to be tested, and therefore they will spread the disease if they have it, in ways that a properly designed health insurance program could reduce. Millions more Americans have no paid sick leave from their job, so they will stay at their job as long as possible. We also have many undocumented immigrants afraid of going to any medical facility because, beyond financial risks, it will subject them to the dangers from ICE or other immigration authorities. Altogether, this is a collection of people so modeled by our healthcare system, medical profit system, that for no fault of their own are colluding with this epidemic. They don't want to, but the system forces them into it. We also have a law in the United States that allows mandatory quarantining of people, but it doesn't cover the cost of quarantine when a person loses his or her home and income. This is crazy. If you quarantine people who have the disease and you'll not cover the cost of it, you give them incentive to not be tested and to avoid quarantine. The Trump administration has certainly made statements about tax relief and aid for airlines and travel companies affected by the crisis. Once again, we see where the priorities are in the capitalist system lie, with the corporations and not the mass of people whose health is threatened. To give you an idea of how things could be otherwise, I'm going to pick one country, South Korea. The epidemiological situation there is more extreme than ours in the United States. At the time of writing, South Korea has a universal healthcare program. On top of that, coronavirus testing is free for every single person in South Korea, and that includes immigrants who are specifically guaranteed that no information about their treatment will be shared with any other governmental institution. You don't have to be a South Korean citizen to get the free testing. Yet, in the United States, a much richer country, nothing like that is being done. And then we have the market system, our proud market system, that is distributing scarce testing kits, scarce masks, and scarce equipment to people who can pay. That's right. If you have a lot of money, you can go on the internet and find these rare healthcare items. They are distributed according to how much money you have, not according to what your need is. Medical personnel need to be safe in treating those who come for testing. They obviously should be in the first in line for getting the equipment and anything else that might help. But in the market system, where instead it goes first to those with the most money. On March 8th, the New York Times regaled us with a list of all the things rich people were doing to escape the virus. The yachts they are moving onto, the bunkers they have created on their property to hide in, the expensive masks that they're able to get worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars. It's charming to watch how the system works in the United Kingdom. The Competition and Markets Authority is monitoring the situation and may ask the government to impose price controls. In other words, there is recognition, at least in the UK, and that the market as an institution fails at dealing with similar situations. And as you know from our show Economic Update, it isn't very good at dealing with many other things either. Coronavirus, a capitalist crisis. Consider the gross failure of the U.S. private profit-driven system. Capitalist medical and industrial complex. 4 industries: doctors, hospitals, drugs and device makers, and medical insurance firms. They decided not to prepare for a serious virus problem. Will so huge a failure finally tip the U.S. ideology and politicians in favor of socializing healthcare? Will the parallel preparatory failure of the U.S. government, long captured by its corporate donors in general, and those of the medical industry complex in particular, boost a resurgent U.S. socialism? Or will a traumatized, socially distanced population turn rightward instead to a dictator for salvation from a clearly out-of-control crisis? Trump, his government, and the system he serves need to blame the corona catastrophe in the United States on something other than U.S. capitalism. and to the Trump GOP nationalism that generally scapegoats foreigners, immigrants, trade partners, etc., official blame targets what Trump calls the Chinese virus. Yet such blaming is racist, divisive, and ignorant. Viruses have always been a part of our natural world. Ongoing mutations have repeatedly produced strains that have caused widespread human sickness and death. That is why medical science has long studied viruses in the 1918 flu epidemic. The H1N1 virus killed almost 700,000 in the United States, plus many millions around the world, and began in Kansas. Yet no one since called it the U.S. virus. H1N1's resurfaced in 2009 as swine flu. Other recent viruses include SARS 2002-04 and MERS since 2012. Given that history of viruses, systematic preparation for future outbreaks of seriously dangerous viruses was obviously no sole need. Availability of sufficient millions of tests was needed for the crucial role of identifying and separating the infected from the uninfected. Producers of ventilators, masks, hospital beds, etc. should have stockpiled them. Training should have been routinized to equip more than enough volunteers to help cope with outbreaks. To block disease transmission, plans should have been made to accommodate social distancing, securing suitable locations, appropriate supervision, distribution of supplies, etc. Likewise, the consequences of social distancing, lost jobs, closed businesses, disrupted supply chains, crippled purchasing power, chaotic credit markets, etc. should have been planned for. The newly unemployed could and should have been reemployed to manage social distancing, yet no remotely adequate planning occurred. U.S. capitalism failed at everything on this partial list of shoulds. Capitalist industries failed to serve public health because private profits were an inadequate incentive for them to do so. The government failed to compensate for private capitalist failures, as usual because government leaders, drawn heavily from corporate CEOs' ranks, share similar mentalities. Knowledge of the dangerous new coronavirus emerged clearly from China in December 2019. CDC documents from this past January show full awareness of its huge threat and of Chinese extreme social distancing measures undertaken to control it. China's massive coordination of public and private resources saw profits displaced by public health as the prioritized goal of bottom line. South Korea acted similarly in contrast. Neoliberalism has arisen and prevailed in many countries since the 1970s. It undermined the state by privatizing and deregulating. Such steps blocked by the kinds of social mobilization achieved in China and South Korea. Such mobilization was and remains more partial, fragmentary, and slower in Italy, the United States, and beyond. When infections and deaths mounted quickly, panic followed. Political leaders saw threats to their positions. Most people began to grasp how misled and unprepared their nations were, that their jobs, income, and lives were in danger. They saw the leaders floundering atop an out-of-control situation. As debt-ridden economies collapsed into sharp recessions or worse, corporate leaders turned, as usual, to the state for bailouts, even given a global capitalism still shook from the results of the 2008-2009 bailouts. Crisis moods overtake most of us as we watch desperate leaders invent failures to cope. Schools are shut, but without plans to handle consequences. Children are not taken care of, taught, or even fed. Parents with children now at home who cannot continue their jobs, emotional strains on families thrown together. No plan exists to train mental health counselors to help work on these problems. Panicked leaders foresee a possible unemployment rate of 20%. It was 25% in 1933. He also proposed cash distribution of $1,000 to $2,000 per taxpayer. That laughably inadequate response typifies what one has come to expect from a government that failed to stockpile tests, masks, and hospital beds. Either public health, including preparedness for viruses, dominates private profit for capitalists, or does not. The coronavirus catastrophe demonstrates the results when public health is subordinate to private profit and to a governmental apparatus that adulates the superiority of profit over public administration. History's latest virus, the coronavirus, has threatened and challenged U.S. society, but it has been our political economy that failed to meet the challenge. To defeat the threat, the catastrophe we are living through was caused by a capitalist system that could not anticipate, plan, or cope with the coronavirus. To get through this catastrophe, as we did with the 1930s depression, yet leave the system intact, will guarantee the next catastrophe. The need for a different economic system and a different government system. 2 is the lesson we need to learn now. Doing so can yield something positive, and the mammoth negatives raining down on us. Capitalism is too inefficient to handle coronavirus pandemic. I'm in a remote location trying to be as safe as I know all of you are trying to do as well. This is a difficult time, but it's also a time when we can learn very valuable lessons that will go far beyond the pandemic that oppresses us now. One of the lessons to be learned from the virus is the utter inefficiency of capitalism. It has exposed this to us in a stunning way that requires some close attention, because what is true about capitalist inefficiency during the coronavirus pandemic is true of all the time. Let me explain. The inefficiency of capitalism in the face of the coronavirus is simple. We know about viral pandemics. We have experienced several over the last half century. They come from time to time. They can be devastating. They can be controlled so they don't spread from one person to another, etc. We know all that. Our scientists know it. Our medical systems know it. In the face of a well-known danger that periodically recurs, the only rational, efficient human response is to prepare, to plan, to have ready the means to minimize death, sickness, damage, and loss. The U.S. should have produced the rest, the test kits, the masks, ventilators, hospital beds, gowns, and other necessary protective gear. We should have also had a plan for social distancing in our schools, workplaces, etc. But capitalism is a system focused on profits. Profits for the enterprise, and profits as soon as possible for the enterprise. We fetishize profits in a capitalist system, and it's a kind of disease. So, none of this preparation was done, because it wasn't profitable. It's not profitable for a company to make ventilators in large numbers, and then to stockpile them for uncertain sale in the future. That's too risky. A loser for a profit system. Ditto for hospital beds, face masks, you name it. Capitalism is a system that makes people do what is profitable. We now have lost so much wealth in human life, with a value that is substantially more than it would have taken to prepare and act adequately. Capitalism wasn't efficient. It was horrifically, inhumanely inefficient. It failed to prepare us for the cost of the pandemic, and that is not unique. Capitalism's private motive is not efficient, and it never was. The capitalist argument is, it's not efficient to provide affordable housing for everybody. What does that mean? It's not profitable? If you took houseless people and you provided them with jobs that they could do more, incomes they could earn, and housing they could afford, the benefits to our society would be enormous. But we don't do that. Not only is that the efficient thing to do, it's also the only humane thing to do. But capitalism is not efficient in dealing with the houseless problem. Or with the coronavirus. Capitalism is a system that puts profits ahead of everything else, and that includes efficiency. No one should worry about the transition from capitalism to socialism, or some other post-capitalist society would compromise efficiency. Capitalism does lots of horrifically inefficient things. That alone is a reason to be far more open to a better system. One that deals with the efficiency question head on. Pursuing profits doesn't magically get us efficiency. It's not doing it now. Never did. COVID-19 was a trigger, but capitalism caused the economic crash. After the dot-com crash in 2000, economic policy aimed to get us back to normal. It sought to recreate or reestablish the U.S. economy as it was before the crisis hit. After the subprime mortgage crisis, economic policy likewise proceeded to recovery. That meant returning to how the economy was before 2008-09. Now, as we sink into an economic depression by reacting so poorly to the coronavirus, Federal Reserve and Trump Treasury policies seek to return us to that great economy Trump boasted about before March 2020. The repeated policy flaw lay not in grasping the basic problems of the U.S. capitalist economy before each. Of the three crashes dodging for the first 2 decades of the new century, those problems were key contributors to those crashes. More important than the events that triggered them, we should not be fooled by the desperate efforts of capitalism's defenders who name crashes after their triggers, which just distracts attention from how and why capitalism's vulnerabilities turn triggers into crashes. Policy aimed to return U.S. capitalists to its status quo, ante-crash, only guarantee passage straight into the next crash. Tendencies toward ever greater inequality and instability have haunted capitalism throughout its history. Capitalism's leaders and ideologues therefore tried everything they could think of to the end. Tame and distract from those tendencies that periodically threaten the system itself. Against inequality, capitalism experimented with progressive tax structures, minimum wages, redistributed schemes, welfare states, universal basic incomes, and so on. Yet, as Thomas Piketty's work shows, capitalism's tendencies to perpetuate great inequality persist. Periodically, when massive uprisings against inequality succeed in stopping or even reversing those tendencies, the stoppages or reversals proved temporary. Against its likewise intrinsic instability, capitalism has repeatedly tried Keynesian monetary and fiscal policies, plus all sorts of reforms, regulations, stabilizers, and so on. However, all failed to stop capitalism's business cycle, the system's recurring accumulation of imbalances and weaknesses culminating in sharp declines, crashes to employment, production, and economic activity generally. The events that trigger each capitalist crash differ as do specific features distinguishing one crash from another. However, the role of the capitalist system itself in periodically reproducing crashes is glaringly evident in the historical record. Before the coronavirus hit the U.S. in March 2020, our economic system was not great, as Trump boasted during his re-election efforts. The corporate sector was lumbering under an immense load of accumulated debt, as the crashes of 2000 and 2008 had ushered in Federal Reserve policies reducing interest rates. U.S. businesses of all sizes found they could borrow limitless amount of money at historically low interest costs. Borrowing became the easiest and cheapest way to solve each and every business problem that arose. Thus, monetary policies try to keep and cope with one capitalist crash help set in motion responses building to the next crash. By closing businesses down, the coronavirus stopped the profits that enabled accumulated corporate debts to be paid. Defaults that undermined and froze credit markets that traded scrutinized corporate debt that deprived instruments insuring the debt and those securities and so on. The U.S. economy before COVID-19 was also home to a private capitalist medical industrial complex. Private profit calculations led to firms in that complex decision to produce not only to produce or stockpile the mass, tests, ventilators, beds, etc., needed to combat a pandemic. The U.S. government, staffed and ideologically controlled by leaders who borrowed from the corporate sector, did not compensate for the private sector's failure to produce or stockpile what was needed for a dangerous virus. Efficiency is generating profits trumped efficiency in securing public health. Losses in wealth since March 1st, 2020 far exceeded the cost of producing and stockpiling needed supplies to contain and combat the virus. Capitalist and private-driven decisions proved monumentally inefficient. Trump's great economy had worsened the income and wealth inequalities that existed in 2016. Obama's government presided over deepening inequalities too. These inequalities constrained mass consumer purchasing power, and that in turn constrained investment and production. The Fed's new money creation and record low interest rates and the post-2008 recovery brought stock price inflation to the stock market. The exploding distance between the stock market and the underlying economy of goods and services production accumulated an imbalance bubble just waiting for a trigger to unravel, burst. The post-2008 recovery lasted longer than the average such period, 4 to 7 years, historically, after a capitalist crash. Larger than average periods usually meant that the next crash, what we are now, would be worse than the average crash, as it is now. The post-2008 recovery also witnessed extreme measures to avoid any basic changes in the capitalist system. For example, efforts to reestablish some version of the Glass-Steagall Act and banking reform in the wake of the 1929 crash were successfully resisted, watered down and delayed by the big private banks. This helped return the economy to its pre-2008 economy normal. With Trump's arrival in 2016, that number to be normal became a rush backwards to an ever less regulated private capitalism. All these developments had helped steer the economy toward its next crash now. To cope with the current crisis, massive direct interventions to transform the economy are needed. In the first place, a massive relief program, patterned on the relief programs developed in the 1930s Great Depression, is needed. Bernie Sanders has developed a solid outline for doing that. Beyond relief, and just as important, production and distribution, and to be reorganized to respect conditions of social distancing alongside ongoing medical testing and monitoring of a threatened population, and monitoring of all populations immediately upon outbreaks of new, dangerous viruses anywhere in the world. Public health must be the priority, far more important than private profits and employer interests. The resulting economy will be very different from, and in many ways, a challenge to that economy existed before March 2020. Because that shared dominant policy goal of Trump, the Republicans and the Democrats, aims to return to a pre-virus normal, what needs to be done was not and is not being done. Employers do not now want to pay the cost of making workplaces safe against coronavirus, yet they want employees back on the job as they were before the pandemic. That goal is not only dangerous to our health in this pandemic, it is also a direct economic threat. The establishment's preferred policies prioritize returning to a capitalist economy with immense dangerous weaknesses over serving public health now. Those bipartisan establishment policies respond to the current crash in ways that launch capitalism towards its next crash. Before COVID-19, we were already due for a crash. Toward the end of April, it's now clear that we're going to have somewhere between 30 and 40 million people filing for unemployment. Let's remember that this is already not only the greatest crash since the Great Depression in the 1930s, but the official unemployment rate underestimates the reality. It does not consider the 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, many of them who have lost their jobs but cannot file for unemployment. Most are afraid to go anywhere near government agencies for fears of being captured by immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, and deported. This is a collapse of enormous significance, and I want to challenge that notion to this crash. It's first and foremost about the coronavirus. It isn't. What do I mean? Capitalism is a 300 to 400-year-old economic system. It is thought to have begun, at least in its modern form, in England back in the 17th century. Capitalism took off from England to the rest of Europe, North America, Japan, and beyond. Now it's our global economic system. Here's a single most important fact about this system's history. Wherever capitalism settled, and as a major dominant economic system, it crashed every 4 to 7 years. Every 4 to 7 years. Suddenly, significant numbers of people lose their jobs, and it's not because they don't want to work as well as they did before, or because they aren't as productive as they were before. It has nothing to do with individual workers. The system itself breaks down. The employer suddenly can't sell what the enterprise produces, and so it lays off employees. Their laid off people could lose their income and buy less things. So other employers can't sell their goods, which means that they lay off their workers. It's a downward spiral that we call recession, a depression, a downturn, a crash, a crisis. We have so many words for this. And studying capitalism's history, we know that this happens every 4 to 7 years. Sometimes the economic crashes are short-lived and don't cut very deep, but other times they cut very deep and last for a very long time. The Great Depression in the 1930s hit in October 1929, and it really didn't end until 1941. That's 11 long years. The Great Depression was a capitalist downturn that was long and deep. They often could be like that. The last one we had was in 2008-2009. It was another deep crash, almost as bad as the Great Depression, and got the name the Great Recession. We're now in the year 2020, and the first 20 years of a new century, we've had 3 economic crashes. The first one, spring 2000, got the name the dot-com crash. The share prices of several high-tech companies skyrocketed. Even though these companies were young and had never earned a profit, eventually buyers of these high-priced shares panicked and sold them. These share prices tanked and took the broader market down too. However, that crash didn't cut too deep and didn't last too long. Then in 2000-2009, we had another, the subprime mortgage crash. It was pretty much on schedule. This was it would cut deep, and it lasted a long time. It started in the middle of 2008 and wasn't done until well into 2010. Now in 2020, the crash is being called the coronavirus crash. Notice how the names are not given to a capitalism that crashes every 4 to 7 years, but rather to whatever sets it off. The trigger in 2000 dot-com stock prices, in 2008 people failing to pay mortgages, and in 2020 a virus. Well, I think it's illegitimate to call these crashes by what triggers them. They ought to be called what they are, the endlessly recurring crashes of an unstable capitalist system. Do the arithmetic. To have 3 crashes in the last 20 years work out to be, on average, every 7 years. If it hadn't been for those particular triggers, it would have been something else. How do I know? Because for 300 to 400 years, it was always something else. It's true that each crisis is unique and has its own unique trigger and condition, but the recurring pattern is something you have to face. Capitalism is an unstable economic system that crashes every 4 to 7 years. A level of instability like that is an enormously important reason to be critical of this system and to try with others to make a transition to a better system. From the beginning, leaders and defenders of capitalism have been trying to overcome its every 4 to 7 year crash pattern. They've tried everything, including government monetary and fiscal policies of all kinds. In the 1930s, we had a new economic model developed by a British economist called John Maynard Keynes. We now call this Keynesian economics, and it focuses on how to stop or manage these crashes, but so far nothing has been found to stop capitalism crashes. That is why we are in one now. If you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved a long time ago. We have a system that doesn't work for most people. It produces grotesque inequality, it is unstable, and is proven incapable of securing our safety during a global pandemic. This virus came at a time when we should have and could have known that our economic system was vulnerable to crashes. Make no mistake. Blaming the virus for this crash muddles the issue. The problem is the system. Those who say they know when the crisis will end are pulling your leg. The first time the unemployment numbers went down, Mr. Trump made a mountain out of this reality. Small molehill in order to make his presidency look anything other than the disaster it is. But in April and May, with skyrocketing unemployment numbers, Mr. Trump finally could say nothing more about how well the economy was doing. But I want to clarify something that has been misreported. The unemployment rate for April and May of 2020 was announced at a little over 13%. However, that was a footnote that said the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, did not count people who said their status is temporary as unemployed. Normally, the opinion of the employed person is neither solicited nor taken seriously, because the question is, are you working or are you not working? Your notion of how long you'll be out of work may be interesting for other purposes, beyond macroeconomic reasons. Nevertheless, if the BLS had counted the people mentioned in their footnote, the unemployment rate would have been 16.5%. And that still would have been low, since it does not count all the undocumented immigrants, millions of them in this country, who lost their jobs. To discuss the unemployment statistics and to know these facts is not only misreporting, but lying by omission. Unemployment is terrible. It has reached a level we could have never imagined we would see again after the Great Depression. This is not going anytime soon, despite what the public relations machine of the extreme right in this country, including the president, might say. We are in the early stage of this crash, and we are not fully aware yet of what is going to happen. Consider the commercial rent crisis. If the landlords win their legal battles and squeeze their commercial tenants for the rent, there is going to be a further increase in unemployment, because many of the tenants are going to go out of business. On the other hand, if the tenants win over the landlords, the outcome might not be quite so bad for the employment, but which side will win these mounting legal battles is unclear. So the glib notion that we're going to be out of the woods as of September, December, or next March is worthless speculation of people who are, they're honest with you, don't know. With economic downturns, we never know how deep they'll go and how long they'll last. That is even more true now because this crash is so much bigger and happening at the same time as a global pandemic hits the world. This makes predicting long-term unemployment a fool's game. In June, the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, revised a January projection, now calculating that the U.S. economy will grow by $7.9 trillion less from 2020 to 2030 than what had been previously projected. This quick calculation gives you an idea of what these predictions are worth. It'd be fine to not know the unknowable, as long as you put a footnote and asterisk there and you explain to people what assumptions you've made. But that uncertainty torments people. So when they ask the questions, there are always people who offer answers. There's a tremendous conflict going on about how to react to all of this, and that is now being fought out in every enterprise and every industry. We have no idea which ones are going to come back. We don't know. Whether restaurants are going to be a business we read about in history books, the way we read about other ancient phenomena that no longer exist. This lack of clarity, the lack of any touchstone that will give us a clear idea, is one of the most important things to keep in mind as we go ahead. Dark times, hard truths. A devastating lack of preparedness in response to both the coronavirus and the economic crash will demonstrate how capitalism failed at managing these twins, overlapping crises. The overlapping failures we're experiencing is the failure to test the population. We haven't tested the vast majority of American people, and it's a disaster that this system has yet to provide for it. Ample and accurate testing is crucial to giving workers and consumers the confidence necessary to reopen America. This problem is underscored when the president or any employer is seen on television urging or even threatening people to go to work, while being silent on any demand or mandate that the employer provide a safe and healthy workplace. But the failure goes beyond that. A story recently in the Los Angeles Times speaks out about the Wild West of virus testing companies. If you read the story, you'll learn that there are many companies trying to jump on the testing bandwagon in various ways. Here's what that means. Profit is the driver. All these companies want to profit from Americans who desperately want to be tested because the system has failed to test them to this point. The article reports on employers buying wildly overpriced testing equipment and not knowing whether the equipment will produce reliable test results or even work at all. Instead of a coordinated national focus on solving this problem by giving priority to testing, we leave the market to solve the problem it helped create in the first place. We allow profit-driven companies to produce and market Who knows what in the way of testing? And when some of these tests turn out to be false or unreliable, then we're going to have people who don't get tested because they don't believe there's a point in it. The problem worsens itself. There's a failure to manage a social problem. And it is a capitalist failure. That's what must be understood. To add to the list of capitalism's failures, in response to the most recent economic crash, the Federal Reserve has decided to purchase more corporate debt. This means that if you are a company and you borrow money into the market, you give the lender, who gives you the money, a certificate called a corporate bond. That bond is your promise as a corporation to repay that loan at a certain point, with interest, over the time between now and then. Here's what is happening now. The corporations go into the market and borrow the money. They have no trouble finding the lender. Why? Because now when the lenders give the corporations a loan and receives a bond, the lender immediately, often within seconds, sells that bond to the Federal Reserve for money that the Fed creates from nothing. The bank started with the money. They lent it to the corporations that got the bond. They sold the bond to the Federal Reserve, and now they have more money than they had started with 25 seconds ago. They've made a little price. They made a nice little piece of change to it. They do this over and over again. Every large company in this country can borrow huge amounts of money this way now. You may be suffering as an unemployed person, one of the 40 million. Your company may be small and going out of business. But if you're big enough to issue bonds, there's no limit. Inequality between big versus medium and small businesses will get worse in the United States. As a result of this, corporations will load upon even more debt than they have now. This is a situation getting worse, not better. On top of this, half of all commercial rents weren't paid in May. Almost as many weren't paid in April. Commercial renters are actually not paying their rents at a higher rate than residential renters. In other words, the capitalists who always tell us that private property is sacrosanct, that contracts cannot be violated, are in fact violating their leases and their contracts for the space they occupy. Landlords are therefore in difficulty. What the landlords will do now is fight back. They're not getting any money from their tenants, so they can't pay back the banks from whom they borrow the money to develop the mall, the store, or whatever it is that they're trying to lease to the commercial tenants. A situation spiraling out of control, and it has serious ramifications because commercial loans have been packaged into securities in just the way that mortgages were led to the crash of 2008-09. As a result, the courtrooms are full of disputes. Landlords are filing suits against the stores who aren't paying rent, dozens of them every day, all across the United States. Banks are beginning to sue the landlords who aren't paying back their loans. The people invested in those securities, those counting on commercial loans to be repaid, are not going to see their money. They will surely sue as well. Millions of companies have been unable to honor all kinds of contracts because of the pandemic, because of the crash, and because the government has handed out money based on political considerations and not based on the underlying economic reality. It is chaotic and will bring more chaos, not just because of the problems with the pandemic, but also with how the capitalist system is being used and abused to treat them. It's unclear who will win, but here's the point. If you're rich enough to hire the best lawyers, you'll win this one, and you'll screw over those who are less wealthy, who can less afford lawyers and all the rest. It's what the French call sauver qui Prt2, everyone for themselves. If the working class doesn't get itself together and mobilize its resources and its people, it will come out on the short end of this game, because everybody else is lawyering up to fight out who gets screwed and who gets saved. The reason people joined the labor movements in the 1930s, the greatest mode of labor union organizing in American history, is because they understood that this is a struggle in which your numbers and the resources you can tap will determine how you come out at the end. Capitalism does not manage its own failures very well, and it's very dangerous to get caught up in these failures without organizing to give you the strength you cannot manage on your own. Alright guys, thank you for listening and joining me for the second half of part 1. I hope to come back probably next week and give you guys part 2. Again, I did release an original version of part 2, but it was not audioed like it should have been. So I will definitely get these first 2 halves to you guys out as soon as possible, so you guys can take a listen, maybe learn a thing or two like I have. And then we'll go from there and have some fun afterwards. Thanks guys, and have a great day.